So guys, welcome. I always like to take stock of our visitors in the class, so the 7 folks you kind of see here, these are the students of the class. They've been listening to me drone on for the past several months about open source. But I'd like to know what areas are joining us otherwise, so what's your major?
Go ahead, Justin.
Mine's business management.
Business management, okay.
I'm accounting.
Accounting?
Information system?
IS, awesome.
International business.
International business, cool, cool.
Finance.
Finance. Yeah.
I have to listen to you drone on and I don't even get credits.
Thank you, Jim, for your valuable contribution.
Glad I could be here.
Yeah, this is super. How about you guys?
Information system.
IS?
Information systems.
I know you.
In case you want to know, or
So these are all IS program students. So our open source class is a kind of an experimental class this semester, more or less because they've never offered anything like this, and then also whether or not I'd be able to keep doing it on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
So, cool. Well, thank you guys for coming. If you have your extra credit forms, please get them ready. Do it later. I'm delighted that Rich Bowen could join us. So Rich is a, as you can kind of see on the slides, a director and a member of the Apache Software Foundation, but actually quite much more. He's also an author, and he wrote the book on the Apache web server. So he's been very much involved in the Apache Software Foundation for a long time. And he's going to come talk to us about what we in the foundation call the Apache Way, and that is kind of everything that governs the foundation and how the projects operate and the things that the foundation does for those projects. So with that, I welcome Rich to the stage. Go ahead and take it away, boss.
All right, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
we're not done, you don't have
Sorry.
So in my day job, by the way, I work for Red Hat, and I understand you had somebody from Red Hat here already. I work in a division of Red Hat called Open Source and Standards, which means I get the great privilege of promoting open source around the world, attending events, but also I'm particularly focused on a cloud computing platform called OpenStack, which I'm sure that some of you have heard of. And I'm also very involved in the CentOS project, which is a Linux distribution based on the Red Hat Enterprise Linux. But anyway, I've been involved with the Apache Software Foundation since 1998-ish. And I've been working on the Apache web server since then. And in the early days, we just had the one project, and everybody kind of understood how things work. And as we have grown, we're now up to almost 300 projects, and it became important to start documenting this thing that we call the Apache Way. And the Apache Way is kind of the way of describing how we do business at the foundation. And so it's a number of different things that come out of our philosophy of open source. And so it's a philosophy of governing software communities. And then this maps into other things because as your community is managed, so your software project is managed. And everything that we do at Apache stems from our history and decisions that were made very early on. So the way that this worked was, if you go all the way back to the beginning, in the late 90s, free software was just starting to become something that businesses were aware of. IBM was particularly involved in free software at the time. The term open source had just been coined in like 96, 97 time period. It was the first time that that word started to be used actively. And then in, not sure of the exact dates, I'm guessing 92, Tim Berners-Lee at CERN developed this thing called the World Wide Web, and there was a software project at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, to produce a free web server. That was called the NCSA web server, and that was written by Rob McCool, and then he graduated and went and got a real job. So in that time, there were a couple dozen businesses had started to use the NCSA web server to run their business online. And this is back when there were only hundreds of websites instead of thousands, but nevertheless, these businesses were relying on this piece of free software, and Rob was no longer around to work on it. And so a couple of the guys shown in this squinty picture here, Brian Bellendorf in particular, was running his business on this, and he says to several of his friends, we need to figure out how to make this thing sustainable. And so there's several things that are important in these early conversations. One is this software must be sustainable. It can't be tied to a particular organization, because when that organization loses interest, the software goes away. And you see that across the history of software. And not only does it need to be sustainable, it also needs to be good code, and it needs to be free. And so Brian started the Apache group, which was a group of 8 at the beginning individuals that were sharing code patches to the NCSA web server. And they shared them via email, and then eventually they shared them via an FTP server that was running on a computer under Brian's desk at work. And over time, the project grew, and it became obvious that we actually needed a legal foundation, primarily so that we could accept donations to keep things running. So anyway, this is a picture from the first ApacheCon in 1998, and a couple of years ago, I guess like 3 years ago, so this feather here, this is actually made of styrofoam, and it was cut in the shape of our logo, and they hung it up on the wall at the conference, and it hangs in my office at home. So a couple of years ago, I took it to ApacheCon in Austin and recreated the picture with all the folks that were able to come. And so here they are, 15 years older, most of them no longer involved in the project, but the project itself has sustained. So what's critical here is that there's a flat management structure. There's nobody that is clearly the project leader. Brian started it, but Brian was never a programmer. Brian was just kind of the driving force that got things going. He defined himself to be the chairperson of the project, which did not mean technical lead. It meant just kind of keeps things moving, does annual reporting on it to make sure that things are still moving in the right direction, handles things like marketing. Now the web server project has grown quite a bit, and these are the folks that are active on the web server project, and your professor is in there somewhere, right? Yeah, there he is on the end. And, but beyond that, the foundation itself has grown to many projects. So this one project started with 8 people. Right now there are 118 people that have contributed to it in some way, but most of them are not active all the time. Of that original group, the only guy that's still actually active on the project is the one sitting on the floor there. The rest of them have moved on to other endeavors, but the project lives on. As of the last board meeting of the Apache Software Foundation, we had 278 projects. And somehow we've got to keep the culture working. We've got to keep our philosophy while expanding to this enormous group of projects. Now, I work for Red Hat, I mentioned that, and when I joined the company, there were nearly 4,000 employees. We just crossed the 12,000 employee mark, And whenever you scale an organization that quickly, it becomes very difficult to impart culture to the people that are coming on board. They're coming from some other corporation with different ideas of how things work. And when you're doing open source and you have this strange idea that you should work hard and give it away for free, it becomes even more difficult to indoctrinate people as they come into the community. But these are two of our core principles. Decision making is always collaborative. It's always, there's no one person calling the shots, it's collaborative. Everyone has to agree or it doesn't count. And everyone has an equal voice in that. And this goes all the way from the graybeards that have been around from day one, like myself, to the people that joined the project last week. Everyone has an equal vote. And you can't veto a decision unless you have a firm technical reason that it's going to break things. Now, in reality, some people, yes?
I was just going to ask, do you have 100%? Do you have a rule that it literally has to be 100% yes, or is it like a 3/5, or is it
It's
3/4?
So there's a couple different answers to that. If it is a technical decision, then the rule is you have to have 3+1s and no vetoes. And a veto has to be accompanied by a technical reason, not just I don't like it or I don't like you. It has to be this will break things. And then you work to resolve that veto into an agreement by fixing the problem that's been exposed. When it comes to community decisions, like should we give this person commit rights? And I see in your syllabus you've talked about that, so that's a familiar concept. In that case, there's no veto, it's just a simple majority. So we're kind of picky about things like voting. But then there's the other answer, which is you shouldn't never have to vote for anything, because if you vote, it means that there's been disagreement. So typically what we do is we simply discuss things on the mailing list until there's rough consensus. And then you move forward with it. If something is forced to a vote, that typically means something's broken. Something's broken in the community. Now, of course, there's other alternate governance models, and I suspect that you've discussed some of these. There's the notion of the benevolent dictator for life, where you have a project like Linux, where Linus Torvalds calls the shots, and he will until the day he dies. And the people in the community are okay with that. I would chafe against a governance model like that, but it seems to work for them. There are projects like OpenStack, where each sub-project has a technical lead that calls the shots on that module. Now, in reality, there's a lot of collaborative discussion that goes on, but because OpenStack is on a strict timetable, somebody has to be that person that calls the shots. And then there's company-driven project management, where you have a lot of projects which are open source in name, but in reality, there's a product manager somewhere that's making all the decisions based on which customer shouts the loudest. And these are all open source to some degree. I tend to think that the Apache model is the best, but that's because I'm biased and I've been doing it for 20 years. Now, we also have a foundation. We have a legal entity that exists for the purpose of managing our finances for the main part. It is a 501c3. So those of you that are in finance probably have some notion of what that means. It's a nonprofit for the public good. It can't benefit one corporation over another. And there's a lot of legal tax restrictions around being a C3. We're that. We have this fancy mission statement, but the core of it is that we exist to develop software for the public good. This is our vision statement, and I'm not going to read this to you, but the core part of this is a consensus-based development process, which is what I was discussing a moment ago with actually collaborating on decisions. At the legal level, because we're a 501c3, we're member-based, and that means that well, members, such as myself, have basically two rights. One is the ability to elect the board of directors, and the other is the ability to invite new members. And so every year, sometimes twice a year, usually just once a year, we have a members meeting in which a board of directors is nominated and elected, and then members can propose new members. The membership then votes on those members. The projects themselves are not managed by the members or by the board. Projects are independent. They just have to run according to certain principles, which are the Apache Way that I'm discussing here. But each project then reports to the board once a quarter. And the board is tasked with reading through all of these reports and determining whether projects are running in a sustainable way. So back to this concept of sustainable, there's a couple definitions of sustainable. One is the one that I already mentioned regarding the preponderance of one corporation in a project. So if you have an open source project where 90% of the committers are from one company, then that project is probably not going to be sustainable in the long term. There's also the notion that there must be at least 3 members of the project management committee that are active. And this goes back to your question a moment ago regarding voting. So you have to vote on a release. Releases are the one thing that we require that projects vote on. When you vote for a release, you're saying, I put my seal of approval on this release that it's good software. And you have to have at least 3 + 1 votes to cut a release. So if you don't have at least 3 active members of the project, then that project is never going to make a release. These are the 2 things that we as the board of directors ensure. 278 projects, each one reports quarterly, which means that every month I have to read about 70 reports from these different projects. So we're looking at ways that we can scale this a little bit better in the future as the foundation continues to grow. So we have this split between running the corporation as a legal entity and the actual technical oversight of the projects themselves. The job of the foundation is to keep things running smoothly and stay out of the way of the software projects. And then the software projects, their job is to produce good software. So the software projects are run by a project management committee, and there's typically this split between the PMC, the project management committee, who make the binding decisions, and the committers, who are the people that are writing the software. Now this varies a great deal from one project to another. Typically, all of the PMC members are committers. Sometimes all of the committers are PMC members. It just varies from one project to another. So we have projects that are crazy concerned about code quality. So a project like Hadoop that has multi-billion-dollar companies based on it, that code has to be right. You can't afford to put out sloppy code. And so their PMC is much smaller than their committers list. They have a PMC that is extremely concerned about code quality and do lots and lots of testing. And then they have a much larger committer pool that are contributing code that goes through that quality control. Then you have some projects where they're more hobby projects and all the committers are PMC members and they're there to have fun. And then there's everything in between. So from the project's perspective, looking up at the foundation is just there to keep the lights on and to provide the group of people that have the years of experience solving problems that might come up. And so the projects look to the membership and to the board as a mentor organization, as well as just keeping the lights on, keeping the website running. providing the infrastructure that's needed to run a software project. Let's see, what else do I have in my notes here? Right, and the foundation, the board, never drives technical decisions. And the projects are responsible for their code, their technical direction, electing new members to their committer list, electing new members to their project management committee. Now, one of the difficulties from a cultural side that we have is this notion of what hat I'm wearing. And this is language that we use frequently within the project. We say things like, well, with my director hat on, but with my member hat on, but with my project contributor hat on, and you may have different opinions depending on which way you're looking at a project. And one of the cultural difficulties we have within the foundation is when, say, someone like myself makes a statement of opinion on a project technical decision, people will say, well, are you speaking as just a contributor to the project, or are you ruling as a board of directors member saying we must do this? And we have these kind of conversations monthly where people are trying to clarify which hat you're wearing when you're making a particular statement. One of the other mantras that we have within the foundation is, if it didn't happen on the mailing list, it didn't happen. Now, I know that a lot of newer software projects tend not to use email mailing lists as their primary form of communication. And so the Apache Software Foundation tends to be seen as a little old school in this regard. We do everything via email. And this email is permanently archived on our website. So you can go back and read 20 years worth of conversation about everything we've ever discussed. And frequently, people will ask a particular question and someone will say, well, in 1997, we had this conversation and here's what we decided then. So we have this extensive precedent, kind of like in the legal system. And then it becomes very onerous to try to change your mind after 15 years when something isn't working anymore, and there'll be these big arguments about precedent. If we have a conversation at a conference, there is always a wrap-up after that where you say, all right, everything that we decided here is not a decision, it's just advice. And so we're going to take that back to the mailing list and archive it there. Now, this isn't just because we're old and tied to the past. It's because we are trying to be as diverse as possible. And by diversity, I'm talking about everything from corporation to geography to gender to language to everything, where you can't allow a conversation just to happen at an expensive dinner at a conference in North America and exclude all of the people in India who are sleeping at the time that couldn't afford to come to the conference or whatever. Those people are as much part of the community as the people that were here. So you take that back to the mailing list and you allow for a reasonable period of time. 72 hours is kind of our rule of thumb, but whatever works, so long as you're sure that the opinion of your entire community has been considered. From the very beginning, Brian was adamant that everything we did needed to be open source, and several of these reasons you've already discussed in this class in great detail. Avoiding vendor lock-in is a critical part of that, and that was driven by the necessities of that first project and then extended to all of our other projects. Open source tends to have a better security record because, at least in theory, more people are looking at the code. Now, if you've been reading the technology news for the last 2 years, you know that this is not always the case. You know that things like SSL, secure websites, have security bugs that go back 10 and 15 years that have been sitting there waiting to be discovered for all this time. So there are, it's not a guarantee of security, but it tends to produce better software. The ability to do frequent releases. Open source tends to move more quickly than commercial software. Again, this is not a guarantee. But the part of it that I find most useful, both at Apache and also at Red Hat, is the ability to incorporate user feedback directly into every release. Because the people that are using the software are often the same people that are writing it, or at least they're participating in the decision-making process rather than it happening around a board table inside corporate walls. Now, I got involved in open source myself for some of these reasons, but more because I saw it as an opportunity to be involved in something that I could really make a difference in. And so, I was fresh out of grad school in a field that was not computer science, and I saw this thing that was in the news all the time, and all of a sudden I knew the people that were making it happen, and I was able to get in there and be part of that, and to an extent make a name for myself. Every job I've ever had has come directly out of my involvement in the Apache Software Foundation, so it's not entirely altruistic. There's a real benefit to being involved in open source. Now, I know that you did talk about licenses, and so you're familiar with this notion of liberal versus restrictive licenses and so forth. We chose on day one to use the BSD license. Now, there were many reasons for this. The main one was that Brian was a student at Berkeley at the time, so he was entrenched in the culture. But also, he was running his own business, and he wanted a license that would allow businesses to take our software and do whatever they wanted with it. Whether that was contributing to an open source project, or even taking that code and making it closed and building commercial software based on it. And the other end of the spectrum is, of course, the GPL license, which requires that everything that you do to the code be then released again. We were already in those early days involved in a number of businesses that were building software based on the NCSA web server. IBM was one of them that was building a commercial product based on open source. And they wanted a license that would allow them to keep doing that. And we wanted a license that would allow them to continue participating in our community and still be happy about their commercial decisions. And so we chose a very liberal license. The very first license, the Apache software license, version 1, was simply the BSD license with Berkeley changed to Apache everywhere. Later on, we added a few more things in there to make it more compliant with the OSI definition of what open source is, and also including a patent grant, which was kind of controversial at the time and is considered pretty standard these days. When we produce a product, we don't allow things with other licenses to be in there. And that's so that people consuming our software don't have to guess. They know if this is Apache license, it's all Apache license, and we won't get surprised by something else. And this is why when you start up a Ford motor car for the first time, you'll see the Apache license scroll across the screen, which is really cool to see that go by, because that software is in there. Or when you play Minecraft, you'll see, as Minecraft is starting up, you'll see in here that it's running Apache code behind it, because this corporation took that functionality, built their software on top of it, and they didn't have to reinvent the wheel there. So, you know, every time I see the Apache name scroll past on something completely unexpected, I take screenshots of it. It makes me giggle.
What did you blank out on that?
No, I was just, I was underlining it.
Oh, okay.
That's not crossing anything out, it's just underlining it. It's using the Apache Commons networking library,
And it looks
I
like
think.
Log4j too.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's right, that's right. I can't read it on my screen, it's too squinty. One of the other definitions of the Apache Way, we talk about the 3 pillars of the Apache Way. That's not, you don't see that in much of our marketing anymore. But these are 3 of the concepts that we talk about. One is meritocracy, and this is, I specifically bring up this word because it tends to be a very contentious word in today's conversation. When we started using the word meritocracy in the late 90s, the concept was that anyone that can contribute should be allowed to, and they should be judged on the merit of their code rather than on who or what they are. In recent conversation, the word meritocracy has taken on another tone, and that tone is that people tend to attribute merit to people that are like themselves. And so you end up with, and this is a real problem in open source and in technology in general, you end up with communities that are comprised mainly of people like me, you know, white middle-aged men. And this is a problem that needs to be combated, and it's something that we're working very hard on. We're not doing a good enough job yet, but I want to point out this word meritocracy because you will see it occasionally on the Apache website, and it is a contentious one.
We actually specifically covered that term.
Oh, good.
Last class and
Okay.
then once or twice before.
All right.
Yeah.
Transparency, that everything is done in the open, and this is a way to ensure that people that want to contribute can, and nothing is happening behind closed doors, that people who are not part of, say, Red Hat, you know, there's a lot of software projects where Red Hat's the dominant player, but because of the way decisions are made in public, people from much smaller organizations or just individuals are able to participate in that. And we believe that great software is an emergent property of great communities. And so community health is at least as important as code health. And we believe that this leads to vendor neutrality and greater diversity and trusted, safe software. And again, these are concepts that you've talked about in earlier classes. And merit is the notion that best ideas win, and this tends to be the phrase that we use more commonly these days within Apache, the emphasis that the best ideas are what's important rather than who is coming up with the ideas. Yeah, I already mentioned this, and you've discussed this before. Meritocracy often ends up meaning oligarchy, so we have a long way to go before this is fixed, and this is an ongoing struggle. Now, as you enter the Apache Software Foundation, you tend to come in as an end user, and from there, hopefully, a few people escalate to being a contributor, and then possibly a project member, and then hopefully a foundation member. One of the things that is interesting to me within Apache is what results in gaining merit, because in many software projects it is writing source code, and I was the second Apache Software Foundation member who had never written a line of program code. The first one was our marketing director, and the second was me. I wrote documentation, and when I was elected a member, one of the funny things about all of the email conversations being archived is you can actually go back to before you were elected and see what people talked about. There was a real contentious discussion Can we elect someone to be a member who's not a programmer? How are they getting merit? How can they participate in our project if they're not a programmer? So, you know, I'd written tens of thousands of lines of documentation, but I hadn't written any code, so am I good enough? And the decision of the community, which has persisted now, you know, for the last 15 years, is yeah, there are many things you can do to gain merit. There's documentation, there's design, there is marketing, there is legal participation, there is hanging out on the IRC channel and giving people end user support. And so because we value community over code, all of these other things are legitimate ways of contributing to a project. Now, this was the slide where I was going to talk about voting, and this question was asked earlier, but we use this terminology of +1 and -1, and we inherited this from the Unix project. And this is how we vote. You'll see people asking a question, and then on the mailing list, someone will reply with +1 or -1, and no other discussion. And that indicates that they're expressing their opinion up or down on a particular thing. You'll also see people say things like -0, which means, well, I'm not actually voting, but this kind of sounds kind of sketchy to me.
What about a +0?
+0 means, in my opinion, doesn't count for anything, but I'm generally supportive of this notion. You know, -0.5, you see stuff like that as well. So codes developed by the community, you have to have these 3 active developers to indicate that a release can be made and that ensures that projects are sustainable. What happens if they're not? And I'm in the midst of writing an article for the Apache website on this right now. All software projects die. This is just a reality of software. So what do you do when a project dies? Well, we have a process for this. It's called the attic. We debated calling this the graveyard or the, I forget what else we were going to call it. We decided to call it the attic. You know, the attic at your grandparents' house where there's the dusty old chest with something up there. But if you want it, you know where you can go get it. So we have the attic where we archive projects that are no longer active, that are no longer sustainable. But maybe there's some people out there that are still using it. We need to be able to have them download that, see the email archives. And then possibly someday those projects might be resurrected if a new business model springs up around that software. That hasn't happened yet, but we hold out hope.
I've actually seen, in 2013 at ApacheCon, there was one guy who was a huge user of a project, and as he kept talking about the project, this project was on the verge of going into the attic. And as he was talking about the project, more people were coming out from the woodwork, and basically it was wow, I had no idea the community was this alive.
Okay.
So I wish I could remember which project it was, but it was kind of teetering on the edge that brought it back on the second floor side of things.
Yeah, and so I mean, when a project's about to go to the attic, we the board, require that decision be discussed publicly, because that does tend to bring people out of the woodwork that say, well, you know, I wasn't going to contribute to this, but if you're going to kill it, I might as well step up and start working on it. So I've talked about all of this process and all of this rules and stuff, and so, you know, there's a lot of myths that are perpetuated around the foundation, and one of these is actually quite true, that there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of process. We try to have as few rules as possible, and we try to not enforce those rules from the top down. We try very hard to stay out of the way of these projects, and what we try to do, this doesn't always happen, but what we try to do is offer advice of what has worked well in the past, what we consider to be best practice, and then let projects make their own decisions on this. There are some things where we absolutely require things to be done a particular way. And these usually have to do with our 501c3 status, with our tax status. We have to do things a particular way. We cannot do things in a way that benefit a particular company over others, particular individuals over others. That's a requirement of US law, of US tax law. There are 2 times in the history of the foundation where the Board of Governors has gone in and taken control away from a project because they were doing things in such a way that was damaging to the foundation, misusing our trademarks, for example, or running a project in a way that was benefiting a particular company over any others. That's only happened twice. I wasn't involved either time. It's not my fault. There's this notion that we are, I mentioned this before, stuck in the past because we're based on mailing lists. I think that this is actually a really important part of our culture. I think that doing things in a way that allows things to be done asynchronously, to allow people to participate around the world, to translate at their leisure, to participate in decisions that happen while they're sleeping, in decisions that happen while they're on vacation, to come back and participate and wake up those conversations and let them have to continue. I feel like that's really important. Almost all of our mailing lists are in English. We have a few exceptions. We have, there's a project called Apache Way, where almost all the conversation happens in Chinese. That is, I think that is unique across our projects. And then we have several projects where there are support lists that happen in other languages, but the main development happens in English. Within the foundation, because we are dedicated to keeping the lights on, there's a number of things that happen that are functions of the foundation that are not coding, and these include travel assistance, legal, public relations, all of these things that are actually paid services that we provide. One of those is my job. I run the conferences, and we do a conference in North America and a conference in Europe every year, and that's something that costs quite a lot of money. So that's part of that's where some of the sponsorship to the foundation goes. But with very few exceptions, what we do at the foundation is volunteer-based. In the spirit of open source, everything is done by volunteers. The exceptions are things that are actually time sensitive. You cannot leave infrastructure support entirely to volunteers because when your website goes down, you need it back up right away. You cannot leave legal support to volunteers because when you get sued, you have to respond to that right away. So there's a lot of things that fall into that. I'm wondering if I have time for everything. The Incubator. We have this thing at Apache called the Incubator where new projects go through boot camp to learn how we do all of these things. And so over the course of months or sometimes even years, they get indoctrinated in all the things that I have said very fast over the last 50 minutes. And they learn how to operate projects in accordance with the Apache Way. There are 2 main things that come out of the Incubator. One is, do they know how to run the project according to the Apache Way? The other one is more the legal requirement. So I mentioned earlier that when we release code, it's under the Apache license, always. When a project comes into the Incubator, it may be under some other license. Before we allow it to graduate, everything has to have been relicensed or rewritten so that it is under the Apache license. This is a duplicate slide from earlier, I think. There's lots of different ways to contribute. One of the most important ways to contribute in open source, in my opinion, is mentorship. And so this scary looking guy is Ken Core, and he is the guy that back in 1998 said to me, hey, you should come talk at ApacheCon. I was like, no way, I'm not doing that. I've got nothing to say. I hate public speaking. And here I am 20 years later, a professional public speaker, because Ken pushed me out of my comfort zone. And the work that you do mentoring lives way beyond you and allows you to amplify your impact to the whole world. It can be kind of a pain, it can feel unproductive to spend 10 days doing a project instead of I know I can do this in 10 minutes. But when you mentor someone through that process, you amplify your effect far into the future. Another thing that mentoring can do is bring out in people the things that they can't even see about themselves. And so this is Sally Canary. She is our marketing director. And she told me 10 years ago, actually, she said, "You would be a great board member. You should stand for the board." And I said, "There's no way I am going to be on the board of directors. I don't do that kind of thing." So now I'm on the board of directors, and that's Sally's fault. Because she pushed me into an area that I was sure that I was no good at. And then a third thing that you can do with mentorship is encourage other people to do the things that you could trivially do yourself. When trying to bring new contributors into a project, what happens so frequently is that people will see a problem in the code and they'll go and fix it without talking to anybody else. But what you could do instead is go to the new person and say, I think you could do this. I think with a little bit of help, I think that you can do this. I can walk you through this. You can put your name on it, and we'll just pretend you did it, and I'll help you out. And this is what Jim did for me. This is Jim Jagilski, and he encouraged me back in '96 to start writing on the documentation. I approached him with a problem in the documentation. I said, the documentation's terrible. And he said effectively, well, here's the keys, go fix it yourself. And out of that came my writing career and all of these things that I did based on that documentation.
Finest documentation in open source projects, in my opinion.
No, thank you. Organizations can contribute in a number of different ways. One is simply by putting coders to work on the project, and that's something that Red Hat does. So most of Red Hat's organization is software engineers who work on open source projects. Some of those open source projects end up being products that we sell. A lot of it doesn't. But by contributing to the community, we build a market and we benefit from that. We're a $3 billion company. Another way that people can contribute to open source is by sponsoring, and for some reason that image is not loading, but that is a picture of all of our sponsors. So for those of you that are Linux geeks, that was actually a SE Linux problem. There's a security problem there. But these are some of our sponsors. These are organizations that help pay for what we do. Running a software organization is expensive. And most of the expense goes into infrastructure. So that big blue slice there is all of our servers, all of our bandwidth, all of our contractors that keep those things running. So that is the bulk of our expense. And then this is closely followed by publicity and marketing, and then by the legal aspects of brand management, because we have a pretty big trademark portfolio that is, the only real asset that we have at the foundation is our trademarks and our reputation, really. Here's some rough numbers. These are numbers from 3 years ago. I mentioned that we're running 300 software projects, and we do all of this at just over $1 million a year, which is really, really low. We do this on an extremely small budget. And again, like I said, almost all of this goes to infrastructure. And then we're doing the rest of this on a tiny budget. You had a session earlier about why companies contribute to open source, how they make a profit at this. Having companies sponsor a nonprofit organization is a difficult sell because they don't get anything out of it tangible. They don't get a vote on the board. They don't get a whole lot of publicity out of it. But a lot of organizations understand that they are contributing back to something that supports them, and so we have sponsors like, let's see, Microsoft builds a lot of their commercial software on top of Apache software. And so they understand that by contributing to open source, financially, they are in fact supporting themselves, because if they stop doing that, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And that's the story with many of these. Google is another company that is built on open source. Pivotal is a company that supports and sells Apache software directly. And they're not necessarily even building solutions on top of that, they're just selling support for it. And then, a lot of other examples here of companies that are very dependent on what we do at Apache. We also have companies that sponsor us just so they can get their logo on our website, which is kind of weird, but whatever, we take their money. So, I have 10 seconds left before the time's up. I didn't think that I would consume quite this much time, but do people have any questions, anything at all that...
You actually have 15 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone?
So I know my students are just about tired of hearing about the ASF.
I'm sure, yeah.
Because that's, it's kind of been, well, I mean, I'm in alignment with the thought that the 501c3 type of foundation is the right way to go, and yada yada. We use a lot of our topics and a lot of the ways that people mechanically do open source in all of the various projects out there. We kind of almost always come back to the ASF, or every now and again like the Linux Foundation.
Okay.
So I'd be surprised if my students actually have any questions about the ASF.
All right.
The
Linux Foundation is a very different model. The companies, when they sponsor, they actually are getting a vote. They are getting a say in how the foundation is run.
And why is that, class? What kind of a foundation are they? A what?
A trade foundation?
That's correct,
A trade foundation? With 501c?
Six.
Yep.
Yeah, they're a trade, what's the actual term? They're
Trade federation.
Trade federation, yeah.
Yeah. So we were looking at 501c types a few classes ago, and we saw one for cemetery workers or something along those lines. There are a lot of really weird categories.
Yeah. 501c3s for software are extremely uncommon these days. There's only about a dozen of them, and there are a couple that were revoked a couple years ago, and they have not granted any new ones in years and years. There haven't been any new ones.
The Software Freedom Conservancy is a fairly new one, right?
Which one?
Software Freedom Conservancy?
Yeah, Brad's organization. That's like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's been any since then.
Who grants those?
The tax.
Yeah,
What's it called? The IRS. Yeah.
What do you do at Red Hat?
At Red Hat, I do what's called community management, and so I do a lot of marketing, a lot of social media, a lot of cat herding. Community manager is a very difficult to define job, but yeah, I do a lot of events. I travel to big software events, open source software events, and promote our products there.
So when you do a lot of like documentation, do you have to understand the code?
Yes and no. So when I was doing documentation for the Apache web server, I never looked at the code in the early days. So I was describing how it worked as an operator, not how the code worked. And as I became more familiar with the project, I did in fact start looking at the code. And you know, when you start looking at the code, you find out that there are many features in software that aren't documented yet. So you go and you actually expose that so people can use it. But it's not necessarily the case that people writing documentation know the source code.
So I have a follow-up question to that. So, I mean, how did you originally get involved in the web server? Were you operating the web server and you said, I wish the documentation was better, or?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I was running a website for my company, and we were actually running it on NCSA.
Oh, okay.
And then after a few months, we moved to Apache, and there was essentially no documentation. There was the configuration file and had a lot of comments in it. And so I started taking those comments and comments in the source code and converting them into actual manual pages.
I don't think you know what man pages are.
Okay. Well, it was just, you know, plain text documents that describe the functionality. And, you know, a lot of the documentation that was there was either incorrect or inscrutable. And so I started working that and trying to make it easier to understand. And then after doing that for about a year, I got a book contract. And I was writing a book, and at the same time I was writing the documentation, and they both kind of played off each other.
So like Apache web server is kind of the main player in like web servers right now. Is that like a correct assumption? Like what?
Yeah.
What was like who else was around in 1998 when those guys who weren't necessarily Apache yet were like, hey, let's take this web server and make it ours?
At that time, there were 3 or 4 web servers. There was NCSA, which was this thing that had been abandoned. There was a company called Netscape, and that company's still around but has changed its colors many times since then. But Netscape, the guys that wrote NCSA, when they graduated, they went and started the next Netscape Corporation. And they had a product called Netscape, I can't even remember what it was called, but it was a web server.
I think it was just a Netscape web server.
Is that what it was called? I thought it had a fancy name.
I think it was a boring name for the web server, and then the browser that
Netscape
kind of
Navigator.
found what, it was more.
And then there was IIS, which is the Microsoft web server, and that's still an active product. And then there was, what was the other one? Yeah, I think those were the main ones.
Maybe.
And within a year of the Apache web server launching, it became the dominant player in the market and is still. Right now there's another competitor called Nginx, which is creeping up on us pretty fast. But right now the 3 major players are Nginx, Apache, and IIS. IIS is still the most popular on Windows servers.
Do you have any metrics about what is I don't know how to describe the biggest project as far as deployment?
As far as deployment?
Yeah, I mean, I would think the web server is still probably that, but
I think the web server is still probably the broadest deployed. You know, that's in the hundreds of millions of installations. The biggest project so far as financial impact is Hadoop. And Hadoop is a big data project that is responsible for a $16 billion industry. The biggest project so far as lines of source code is OpenOffice. Yeah. We have a website called projects.apache.org that lists all of our projects and has basic statistics about them if you want to see what kind of projects we have and what technology spaces they're in. In the early days, everything we did was back-end server kind of things. And now we have mobile phone application development toolkits and desktop publishing and medical software, weather prediction software. We have a lot of different spaces that we're in right now.
When I also point out one of the things that I need to further point out, that the board doesn't decide what code gets created. They also don't necessarily care about what projects are in the foundation, because there are plenty of projects that would be considered competitors to each other, right? They kind of scratch the same itch, and that's just fine.
Yeah, projects in the foundation that are direct competitors to one another, yeah. This is particularly true in the big data area. We have a lot of projects that do very similar things in big data. We also have 3 message queue projects, and we've got 2 web server-ish projects.
Seemed there were a lot of CMS systems for a while too.
Yeah, most of those are not around anymore.
Any other questions, guys? Otherwise, thank you, Rich. I really appreciate you.